What's up, guys? So this video that I have here is going to be very different from the normal content I post on this channel, but I figure I don't have the subscriber count to feel like I need to hold myself to like a higher standard in terms of like only posting like one specific type of content. I kind of treat this as like a portfolio of work that I'm generally happy about or excited to share or just like working on. So if this isn't your cup of tea and you're here from my previous videos, then don't worry. Like, this isn't me switching to a new form of content. This is just like a video that I wanted to make. I might make more like this. I'll have to see how I feel about that. But there are definitely more those like debate type videos coming out as well. That being said, we're just gonna get started because we've got quite a long video ahead of us. I'm going to open with a quote, which is, "The tragedy of this world is that no one is happy, whether stuck in a time of pain or of joy," by Alan Lightman. This quote is one that popped up in my TikTok feed on one of my long scrolling sessions, which I am happy the report have been getting progressively slower. And it's one that got me thinking on the topic of happiness and how we generally seem to view it. And an obvious disclaimer for this, I am speaking on the topic of happiness from my own personal experience in what I have perceived to be the experiences of the people around me. My views and opinions on this are purely vibes based and not based on really definitive, hard, solid truths about the human experience. But a few things are. So just know this is more opinion based and less like of a factual claim. To start my discussion, I think it'll be helpful to technically define happiness. And Merriam-Webster defines it as a state of well-being and contentment, with the synonym being joy. And this is where I would like to make my first unsubstantiated claim, which is that this definition doesn't seem to quite hit the mark on how we see happiness or how it really is used as a term contemporarily. If I asked whether you believed that happiness was captured and described wholly by the synonym contentedness, I assert that you would probably say no and admit to there being, on some level, more nuance and complexity to the topic. I will define here what I believe to be the difference between the terms. To be content is to be satisfied with life and feel a sense of peace and acceptance of your current circumstances, whereas happiness, on the other hand, seems to go a step further. Happiness is a greater sense of joy than just contentment. It generally is seen as a feeling of like elatedness or immense pleasure that is like outside your normal experience. And this distinction, while seemingly unimportant, is one that I think is important to recognize in the context of an important question we all face, which is, should it be our goal to be happy? We all recognize that being happy constantly is not only difficult, but likely impossible for anyone outside of people that possess like specific neurological abnormalities, But I would go a step further and say that even the ideal of wanting to maximize one's own happiness is not only unimportant for living a fulfilling life, but also counterproductive to the goal of maximizing happiness. That is to say, taking actionable steps to make yourself happier is you working against your own goal, as strange as that claim may seem to be. To support my claim, I would like to ask the viewer to engage in a thought exercise with me. Think back to the last time you really wanted something and were able to get it. This could be a promotion at work, acceptance into a dream school, a good grade on an exam, etc. Chances are, if this isn't something that has happened to you within the past week, you haven't really given much thought to it in the past few days. And yet, do you remember what it was like when you were waiting for those results to come in? The anxiousness you experienced that seemed to consume whole hours of your day? In those weeks leading up to your finally hearing the good news? The point I mean to illustrate is that we seem to tend to allow ourselves to build up anxiety and anticipation for an event, maybe even telling ourselves if we could just get this one thing, then that's all we could ever need and we would be able to live our happy and contented lives. But how often is that actually the case? And this is definitely not something I'm guiltless of. I find myself moving the goalpost quite often for myself. The company I started is in its early stages, and as such, it's very easy for me to get anxious or worked up to try to push it to the next steps. I found myself saying to myself, if I could only get my first few customers, that's all I want. Then after the first few customers come in, it becomes, if only I could just get some customers through referrals so I know that my course is working. Then after I got referrals, it became, if only I could have X many customers, then I could do this for the rest of my life. And now I'm currently at, if only I could get 2x many customers, I'm sure this pattern will continue. So this tendency, while worth trying to push back against, is nothing to be ashamed of. As humans, it seems to, for one reason or another, be something that's hardwired into us, and evolutionarily, it seems to make sense. If our ancestor had relished too long on the success of a recent hunt and neglected to plan for what they would eat the next day, they likely would not have survived. We are, by the nature of our very beings, very motivated by the idea of maximizing our future happiness by acquiring the things we need. And interestingly, in the process of looking towards the future, we make our current selves' happiness conditional on our future selves. We tell ourselves that we cannot be happy unless these goals are reached. And since we set these goals to be so far ahead, that leads us to not being happy in the moment. And when the time finally comes to reap the benefits of our hard work, we have very quickly moved on to our next fixation. This observation of this tendency of mine has motivated my opinion on happiness as a whole. Taking active, actionable steps towards maximizing our happiness tends to make us more unhappy overall, because actionable steps are, by their very nature, acknowledgments that we can't and shouldn't be fully happy with our current circumstances. But that isn't to say that it necessarily forbids us from being content with our current circumstances. And yet, so often we allow it to. Constantly chasing the feeling of elation that we get from meeting our current goals does, on some level, eat away at our personal contentment. The desire to feel that dopamine rush often leads us to take our contentment for granted, and even stifle those moments of happiness when they do arise. It is not bad to want to be happy, but it is bad to prioritize that happiness for a future version of yourself over the contentment you currently feel. After all, in this exact moment, your present self is the only version of you who can experience anything. Now, to illustrate the next point I would like to make, I want to share a quote with you all. This quote comes from a cartoon show called Rick and Morty. The context of the quote is not actually super important for understanding the point that the character is making, but for those who might be curious, the episode is called Fear No Mort, and it's the 7th episode of season 10. The quote is as follows: "Happiness is a trap. It can't last forever. Let's say you meet the love of your life. Well, it's still going to end. It's inevitable, whether by the slow pull of a disease or the shock of loose footing on a hiking trail. Whether it be the corrosion of two personalities that reshape each other until they're incompatible, or maybe the old stranger in a bar who says the things that need to be said to that person that night. The point is, happiness always ends. Best case scenario, think about this. Best case is that you die at the same time." Now, let's formalize this claim a bit. We can start with premise 1, which is that happiness is only meaningful if it is permanent. Premise 2 is then that happiness always ends. And premise 3 is that the pursuit often leads to disillusionment and disappointment. So the way I interpret this quote, these are 3 premises that are necessary beliefs to have and to ascribe to in order to reach the ultimate conclusion and claim of the quote, which is that happiness is a trap, which is to say, an enticement that ultimately leads to suffering that outweighs any benefits. Now, while formalizing the quote in such a way may seem pedantic and even pretentious, there is a benefit to syllogisms in their ability to streamline discussions. For those who might be unfamiliar, this deconstruction of the argument allows any potential disagreeers to point to a specific premise or axiom present in the claim that makes the syllogism invalid in their worldview. In my case, I would have a point of contention with premise 1, which is that happiness is only meaningful if it's permanent. That is to say, I do not believe that happiness has value that's only tied to its permanence. In fact, it is demonstrably not a belief that most people hold. Ignoring for a moment the concept of the afterlife, if we all held the belief that happiness was only meaningful if it was permanent, then, we would not care for being happy, as our lives are undeniably impermanent. At least our mortal lives, right? But that being said, that is not a proof that happiness matters despite its impermanence, merely an acknowledgement that it isn't a view that I think most people hold. To actually argue against the point, I would like to bring your attention to an admittedly platitudinous excuse me, a platitude, but an analogy. Imagine you're watching a beautiful sunset and you know it'll only last a few moments before the sun dips below the horizon and the vibrant colors fade into the night sky. Yet, despite its transience, people often find immense joy and meaning in that fleeting experience. No healthy individual looks at a sunset and says, "This is pointless because it won't last forever." The beauty of the moment is valuable in itself, even if the sunset itself is only temporary. Not only that, but here is a moment where the contrast between happiness and contentment is key. Happiness, in some sense, is an emotion of diminishing returns, due largely to its physiological nature. Over time, repeating activities that give us immense dopamine and serotonin rushes builds our tolerance, and achieving the same pleasurable sensations requires higher amounts of stimulation. Even if we don't equate happiness to these neurochemicals, we can see this effect clearly in our daily lives. Even in the smaller cases, we know that the rush of getting exciting news isn't going to last forever, and yet we choose to enjoy it anyway. And to adopt yet another common platitude, happiness doesn't really have the same kick to it if it doesn't come after a period of dull or sadness. A hypothetical happiness that is permanent, to me, seems more like a period of contentment anyway, due to the diminishing nature of its returns. And it is worth acknowledging that this rebuttal on my end is largely informed by opinion, as opposed to fact, as I mentioned earlier. You can logically be consistent and hold the view that happiness is a trap, and I will reiterate that to some degree I do agree with that assessment. But I only agree insofar as saying that the pursuit of happiness as an end goal is counterproductive to being happy. Okay, so I've hammered home the idea that I think happiness as an end goal is the wrong ambition, but what then is the alternative? Well, to propose my alternative, let's draw a comparison. The way I describe the task of attaining happiness as a goal is not without parallels to the story of Sisyphus. For those unfamiliar, the gist of the story is as follows. Sisyphus was a man who constantly angered the gods. As punishment, he was condemned to pushing a boulder to the top of a hill, only for the boulder to roll back down to the bottom once he reached the top, causing him to repeat the process over and over for all of eternity. This constant and eternal process can, in some ways, be analogized with the pursuit of a state of eternal happiness. We toil and toil away in an attempt to improve our current situation, and once we reach our goals, we find new problems to adopt. In some ways, we spend so much time focusing on our future happiness that we forget to enjoy the happiness we have in our present moments. In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus, pronounced Camus but spelled Camus because, as with all words that don't make sense, he is French, addressed a similar issue related to life's unseemingly pointless struggles, although he more so explains it from a perspective on the absurdity that comes from life's lack of inherent meaning. But still, his quote regarding the struggle still provides a worthwhile idea to consider for the context of my arguments here. Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Again, I don't mean to misappropriate Camus' quote here and claim that is in support of my own. Instead, I simply mean to adopt this idea. To me, the most healthy and beneficial way to view happiness is not as an end goal, but an experience one can have in their attempts to reach higher heights. Whether this is in submitting our job applications, going to the gym, or participating in any number of activities that we normally engage in with the result-oriented mindset, if we can find happiness and fulfillment in the action of bettering ourselves, we will be all the better off for it. And, of course, even in this way, we will not be happy all the time. But our happiness will come as a direct result of present action as opposed to future circumstances. And, of course, attaining happiness through action isn't anything we can magically flip a switch for, but it is definitely something we can all do. This may seem like a bold claim, and of course I'm not denying the fact that there are circumstances that are unique to each and every person, but I do think that to a degree, humans have a great degree of autonomy over their emotional state. Take into account the objectivity of reality as a whole. It is an undeniable fact that we ascribe emotional responses to events that are objectively neutral to the world as a whole. Imagine a small lone farmer living in a Midwestern United States. Say one day while the farmer was gone, the terrible tornado came through and destroyed his house. This can clearly and reasonably be perceived as a bad event for the farmer, and I would, of course, never argue that he shouldn't be upset by this. That being said, imagine for a moment a world where the farmer, before the events of the tornado, ceased to exist, just blipped out of reality. Then the act of the tornado blowing through his house is largely neutral, as there is no one to perceive the effects of it. This example might be a little weird and abstract, but the point I mean to illustrate is that worldly events are not objectively good or bad. They do depend on our being there to perceive them, and thus on how we perceive them. Training ourselves to enjoy the steps we take towards our goal is hard, but something we can do, because we have the power over how we view the things we do. Gratitude for even the smallest actions we can take goes a long way. People are capable of finding happy days in situations that others would never want to be in. In some ways, our happiness is almost fully relative and based on our expectations. To conclude this exploration, I would like to go back to the question, how should we view happiness in our lives? The answer, it seems, lies in redefining happiness and where we should seek it. Instead of viewing happiness as some perpetually distant end goal, we should treat it more so as a companion that can join us on our journey from where we are to where we want to be, and maybe then we can find enjoyment in our climb.